There is a wall in Washington, D.C. that most people walk past without stopping. Not the Vietnam Wall, not the Lincoln Memorial, a smaller wall, less famous, less visited. It lists the names of 36,574 Americans who died in a war that their own country could not decide what to call. Not a war, the government said. A police action, a conflict, a situation. Anything but a war. Because if it was a war, someone would have to explain why it started, why it ended the way it did, why the line drawn at the end was almost exactly the same as the line that existed at the beginning, and why, 70 years later, that line is still there. Korea is the war America fought, forgot, and never finished. And the two countries that faced each other across those frozen hills in 1950 are facing each other again today, still not quite sure what they learned the last time. In the summer of 1950, most Americans could not find Korea on a map. It was a peninsula on the other side of the world, a place that had been occupied by Japan for decades, liberated at the end of World War II, and then divided almost carelessly along a line of latitude by two powers who had other things on their minds. The 38th parallel. North of it, a communist government backed by the Soviet Union and China. South of it, a fragile democracy backed by the United States. Between them, a border that had been drawn not by Koreans, but by the world that had decided Korea's fate without asking Korea. When North Korean forces crossed that border on June 25, 1950, the United States made a decision that would cost more than 50,000 American lives and reshape the relationship between America and China for the next 7 decades. They decided to fight. Not because Korea was strategically vital, not because American lives were directly threatened, but because the logic of the Cold War had created a world in which every border, every government, every line on every map had become a test of who was stronger, who was more willing, who would blink first. And in that logic, a small peninsula that most Americans could not name became the place where two of the most powerful nations on Earth decided to find out what the other was made of. What they found was not what either of them expected. The summer, everything moved too fast. The first weeks of the Korean War were a catastrophe for the United States. The American military in 1950 was not what it had been in 1945. 5 years of peacetime had hollowed it out. Troops were undertrained, equipment was outdated. Units that had been battle-hardened in the Pacific and Europe had been demobilized, their men sent home, their institutional knowledge scattered. The soldiers who were rushed to Korea in the summer of 1950 were often young men who had never seen combat. Some had been stationed in occupied Japan, living relatively comfortable lives, their days filled with routine garrison duties rather than preparation for war. They were put on planes and ships and sent to a country they did not know, to fight an enemy they had not been briefed on, in terrain that their training had not prepared them for. Private Kenneth Shadrick was 19 years old. He was from Skinfork, West Virginia. He became the first confirmed American killed in action in the Korean War on July 5, 1950, 9 days after the fighting began. He had been in Korea for less than a week. His mother learned about his death from a journalist. No official notification had reached her yet. That detail says something about how fast everything moved and how unprepared everyone was. The North Korean People's Army pushed south with a speed and force that caught American and South Korean defenders completely off guard. They had Soviet-built T-34 tanks. They had artillery. They had soldiers who had been fighting since the 1930s, veterans of the Chinese Civil War, veterans of the war against Japan, men who had spent their entire adult lives in combat. Against them, American units that had not fired their weapons in months. The result was a rout, the Pusan Perimeter, a small corner of the Korean peninsula where American and South Korean forces were compressed into a shrinking pocket, fighting to hold on while reinforcements were rushed across the Pacific. For weeks, it was not clear they would survive. General Douglas MacArthur, who had commanded the Pacific Theater in World War II and carried himself with the absolute certainty of a man who had never seriously doubted himself, watched the situation from Tokyo and planned his response. What he planned was audacious: an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port on the western coast of Korea, far behind North Korean lines. The military planners said it was too risky. The tides at Incheon were among the most extreme in the world. The harbor was treacherous. The timing would have to be precise to the minute. MacArthur said he would do it anyway. On September 15, 1950, American forces landed at Incheon. It worked. Within weeks, the North Korean army, which had been on the edge of total victory, collapsed. Seoul was recaptured. The North Koreans retreated back across the 38th parallel. And in that moment of sudden, unexpected success, a decision was made that would change everything. MacArthur was given permission to cross the 38th parallel and pursue the North Korean forces into the north. The original mission had been to restore the border. Now the mission became something larger, something that had not been fully thought through, something that would bring China into the war. The warning nobody heard China had been watching. Since the moment American forces landed in Korea, Beijing had been watching. The People's Republic of China was 1 year old in 1950. Mao Zedong had won the Civil War against Chiang Kai-shek only in October 1949. The country was exhausted from decades of war. Its economy was shattered. Its military was powerful in numbers but primitive in technology. The last thing China needed was another war. But China had a border with North Korea, a border defined by the Yalu River, and as American forces pushed north through Korea in the autumn of 1950, they were moving toward that river. Moving toward China, Beijing sent warnings through diplomatic channels, through intermediaries, through statements that were clear in intent, if not always in language. If American forces approached the Yalu River, China would intervene. This was not a bluff. It was not rhetoric. It was a statement of strategic reality from a government that had decided, after careful calculation, that a hostile American presence on its border was a threat it could not accept. MacArthur dismissed the warnings. He told Washington that China would not intervene, that if they did intervene, American air power would destroy them, that the war would be over by Christmas. He was wrong about all of it. On the night of October 19, 1950, Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu River, not in small numbers, not as advisors or volunteers in any meaningful sense. 300,000 soldiers, moving at night, without air cover, without kind of logistical support for that American military doctrine considered the minimum requirement for a military operation. Moving on foot, in the dark, through mountain terrain, carrying what they could carry, eating what they could find. By the standards of modern warfare, it should not have been possible. But it happened, and for weeks, it happened invisibly. The first Chinese units made contact with American forces in late October, fought brief engagements, and then withdrew. MacArthur's headquarters interpreted this as a limited intervention, perhaps a token force sent to protect Chinese interests near the border. It was not a token force. It was the advance guard of an army that was waiting in the mountains for the Americans to advance further. An army that understood the terrain, the cold, and the value of patience in a way that the Americans, flush with the confidence of Incheon, had stopped considering. On the night of November 25, 1950, that army attacked. The night the mountain moved, the soldiers who survived the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir described it in terms that did not sound like military history. They described it like a natural disaster, like the mountain itself had come alive. American and South Korean forces were spread across the high ground around the Chosin Reservoir in northeastern Korea. The temperature was dropping toward minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The terrain was rugged, the roads narrow, the supply lines stretched. And in the darkness of November 27, 1950, Chinese forces hit them from every direction at once. Bugles in the night. That is the detail that appears in almost every account. Not radio communications, not artillery preparation, bugles, and then the sound of tens of thousands of men moving through frozen ground. The Marines at Chosin were surrounded. 17 miles of road between their position and the sea. 17 Chinese forces on every ridgeline. 17 miles in temperatures that could kill a man who stopped moving for too long. What followed was one of the most brutal retreats in American military history. Not a rout, a fighting withdrawal. The Marines carried their dead with them. They carried their wounded. They broke through Chinese positions that were supposed to be impassable. General Oliver Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, said something that became one of the most quoted lines of the Korean War. Retreat. Hell, we're not retreating. We're just attacking in a different direction. It was the kind of thing a man says when the alternative is admitting that everything has gone wrong. Everything had gone wrong. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was now a different war entirely. A war where the enemy was not the broken remnants of a North Korean army. A war where the enemy was the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had appeared from nowhere and were now pressing south with a momentum that the Americans and their allies could not immediately stop. Seoul fell to Chinese and North Korean forces in January 1951. For the second time in less than a year, the South Korean capital was in enemy hands. For the second time, American forces had to fight their way back. The war that had seemed almost won in October had become a grinding, brutal, attritional struggle with no clear end in sight. MacArthur, who had been wrong about China's intentions and wrong about the consequences, responded by demanding permission to expand the war, to bomb Chinese bases across the Yalu, to use nuclear weapons if necessary, to bring Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces from Taiwan into the fight. President Truman said no. MacArthur went public with his disagreements. He wrote letters to Republican congressmen criticizing the president's strategy. He issued statements to the press that undermined American diplomatic efforts. Truman fired him. The general who had commanded the Pacific in World War II, who had accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, who had been treated as something close to a living monument, was relieved of command for insubordination. It was the right decision. It was also a decision that clarified something important about the Korean War. This was not a war America intended to win in the old sense. This was a war America intended to manage, to contain, to bring to a negotiated end somewhere close to where it had started. The logic of total victory, the logic of World War II, had been replaced by something more ambiguous, something that the American public, raised on the stories of 1945, did not yet have a language for. The people between while the generals argued and the diplomats negotiated, the Korean people lived inside the war. This is the part of the story that gets lost most easily. The war began as a conflict between two Koreas, backed by great powers. But the people who suffered most were not the great powers. They were the families caught between the armies. In the summer of 1950, as North Korean forces swept south, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled ahead of them. They carried what they could carry. They walked roads that were also being used by retreating military units. They crossed bridges before they were blown. Some did not make it across in time. When Chinese forces drove south in the winter of 1950, the same thing happened in reverse. The roads north of Seoul became rivers of people moving south in the cold. Families separated in the chaos. Children lost. Parents left behind. A country that had already been divided by ideology, now being divided by the physical reality of millions of people in motion. The city of Seoul changed hands 4 times during the war. 4 times, the people who remained in the city had to adjust to a new occupying force. 4 times, they had to calculate who to trust, what to say, how to survive. For many Korean families, the war created a division that was not just political but personal. Family members ended up on different sides of the 38th parallel. Brothers separated from brothers, parents from children, husbands from wives. The division of Korea was not just a line on a map. It was a wound through the middle of families that had never chosen to be divided. Some of those families waited for reunification for decades. Some are still waiting. There are South Koreans alive today who have not seen a sibling or a parent since 1950, who do not know if that person is alive or dead, who have spent 70 years on one side of a border that was supposed to be temporary and has become somehow permanent. This is what gets forgotten when Korea is called the Forgotten War. Not just the American soldiers who died on frozen hills, but the people whose country became the testing ground for someone else's Cold War, whose families were divided by a line that 2 exhausted American colonels drew on a map in August 1945, working through the night without ever consulting a Korean. The war that learned to stand still. By the summer of 1951, the Korean War had settled into something that looked less like the wars people knew and more like something new and deeply uncomfortable. A line of contact roughly along the 38th parallel. 2 armies facing each other across fortified positions. Negotiations beginning at a place called Panmunjom and fighting continuing. Not the sweeping movements of 1950, not armies advancing hundreds of miles in weeks. Trench warfare. Battles for individual hills with names that meant nothing before the war and became famous only because so many men died on them. Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, the Punch Bowl. Men dying for ground that would sometimes be given back in the next round of negotiations. The futility of it had a particular psychological weight. In World War II, you could point to a map and see progress. You could see the Allied forces moving toward Berlin. You could understand what your sacrifice was purchasing. In Korea, in 1952, a soldier could be wounded taking a hill, watch his unit hold it for a week, and then see it abandoned as part of an armistice negotiation he knew nothing about. What do you do with that? What story do you tell yourself about why it mattered? The negotiations at Panmunjom dragged on for 2 years. 2 years of talking while fighting continued. Thousands of men dying during a negotiation about how to stop men from dying. One of the central issues was prisoners of war. The Chinese and North Koreans wanted all prisoners repatriated, returned to their home countries regardless of their wishes. The Americans insisted that prisoners who did not want to return to communist countries should have the right to choose. It was a debate about ideology as much as logistics, about the message that would be sent to the world about which system, communism or democracy, men would choose when given a free choice. The argument cost months and lives. Men continued to die on Heartbreak Ridge while diplomats argued about the principle of voluntary repatriation. History rarely makes the trade seem fair. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. Not a peace treaty, an armistice. A cessation of hostilities, a pause. The line of contact became the demilitarized zone, a strip of land 2.5 miles wide running across the Korean peninsula, one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. And there it has remained. For more than 70 years, the Korean War is technically not over. There has never been a peace treaty. The 2 Koreas are still officially at war. The armistice is still in effect, and the DMZ still divides a peninsula and a people who were never asked whether they wanted to be divided. What America and China learned and didn't. The Korean War ended in a way that neither America nor China could call victory. But both countries drew lessons from it. Some of those lessons were right, some were wrong. And the wrong lessons have shaped the relationship between these 2 powers for 7 decades. America learned that China would fight, that the new communist government in Beijing was not a paper tiger, not a Soviet puppet that would fold under pressure, but a military force that could absorb enormous casualties and keep moving. That was a real lesson. What America was slower to learn was why China fought. Not ideology alone, not loyalty to North Korea, but geography, history. The logic of a country that had been invaded and occupied and carved up by outside powers for a century and had decided, with the establishment of the People's Republic, that it would never again allow a hostile military force to operate on its doorstep. China learned that America would not back down, that the United States, despite its internal debates, despite its political divisions, despite a public that had not fully understood why it was fighting in Korea, would commit its military and absorb significant casualties rather than allow what it perceived as communist expansion. That was a real lesson. What China was slower to learn, or perhaps chose not to accept, was the American sense of its own role, not imperialism in the traditional sense. Something more complicated and more confused. A country that genuinely believed it was defending freedom while also, in the same action, pursuing its own strategic interests. A country that could simultaneously be sincere about its values and wrong about its methods. The gap between those two lessons, America not fully understanding Chinese strategic anxiety, China not fully understanding American strategic confusion, is a gap that has never been fully closed. It is the gap that makes every interaction between these two powers more dangerous than it needs to be. Korea did not resolve the question of how America and China relate to each other. It established the terms of a competition that is still ongoing, a competition that has moved from frozen hills to trade negotiations, from artillery exchanges to technology restrictions, from soldiers at the Yalu River to diplomats in Geneva. The weapons have changed. The fundamental dynamic has not. Two powers, both convinced of the rightness of their own position, both carrying historical wounds that the other does not fully understand, both capable of catastrophic miscalculation, trying to find a way to exist in the same world without destroying it. That was the question Korea asked in 1950. It is still the question being asked today. The war that is still happening today, the Korean peninsula is one of the most watched borders in the world. Satellites track movements along the DMZ in real time. American troops are still stationed in South Korea, nearly 30,000 of them, more than 70 years after the armistice. North Korea has nuclear weapons. South Korea has become one of the most technologically advanced economies in the world. The two halves of the same country, divided by a line drawn by two American colonels working through the night in August 1945, have become almost unrecognizable to each other. And the families divided by that line are still divided. The last reunion of separated Korean families happened in 2018. Elderly men and women, some in their 80s and 90s, meeting siblings and children they had not seen in nearly 70 years. They were given a few hours, then they were separated again, because the border is still there. And the war that created it has never officially ended. There is a photograph taken at one of those reunion events. An old woman holding the hands of a brother she had not seen since 1950. She is not crying. She is past crying. She is just looking at him with an expression that has no name in any language. The expression of someone who has waited so long for something that when it finally arrives, joy and grief have become indistinguishable from each other. She held his hands for 3 hours. Then she went back to Seoul. He went back to Pyongyang, and the line between them closed again. Korea is called the Forgotten War. Forgotten by America, which moved on to Vietnam, and then to a dozen other conflicts and rarely looked back. Forgotten by China, which built a new relationship with the United States in the 1970s and learned to speak of Korea as a historical episode rather than a living wound. Forgotten by the world, which found other crises to occupy its attention, but not forgotten by the Korean families who are still separated. Not forgotten by the soldiers whose names are on that wall in Washington that most people walk past without stopping. Not forgotten by the veterans who came home to a country that did not hold parades for them, did not make films about their war, did not build a memorial until 1995, 42 years after the armistice. When the Korean War Veterans Memorial was finally dedicated in Washington, one of the survivors said something that has stayed with us. He said, "Freedom is not free." It was a simple sentence, almost a cliché, but he said it with the weight of a man who had stood in -30-degree cold on a frozen Korean hill and watched the men beside him fall, and had spent 40 years wondering what it had all been for. And the honest answer, the answer that history gives us, if we are willing to receive it, is complicated. It was for something. The South Korea that exists today, prosperous, democratic, creative, connected, is partly a product of the decision made in 1950 to fight. And it was also shaped by choices that cost more than they needed to. By a MacArthur who overreached. By warnings that were dismissed. By a war that was managed rather than won. By leaders who were not always honest with their people about what they were doing and why. By a division that was supposed to be temporary and has lasted 3 generations. The Korean War does not offer clean lessons. It offers complicated ones about the danger of assuming you understand your enemy's intentions, about the cost of ignoring warnings from people who have thought carefully about their own interests, about what happens when the logic of competition overrides the logic of communication, about a peninsula of people who deserved better than to become the ground on which great powers tested each other. The last time America and China went to war, neither side fully understood what it was getting into. Neither side fully understood what the other feared. Neither side walked away with a clear victory. And neither side has fully absorbed what that means. Today, in trade negotiations and technology disputes and military positioning in the Pacific, the same dynamic is playing out. The same mutual incomprehension. The same tendency to see the other's actions as aggression rather than anxiety. The same risk that a miscalculation in a place neither power fully understands could become something neither power wanted. Korea ended in an armistice. Not peace, just a pause. The question that pause left open is the same question that every generation since 1953 has inherited. Can 2 powers this different, this large, convinced of their own rightness, find a way to share the world without the pause becoming something worse? The old woman in the photograph held her brother's hands for 3 hours. Then the border closed again. The answer is not yet. But not yet is not never. And perhaps that is the honest thing that can be said about Korea and about the relationship it helped define. The war never ended. The question never went away. And the people who paid the highest price are still waiting for an answer that the great powers have not yet found the courage to give them.